Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel. I'm so glad you've joined me this evening, and I've got two phenomenal stories for you tonight that you're just going to love. Before we get started, I just want to welcome my listeners all over North America, Canada and the rest of the world. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. And if you haven't subscribed to my channel, please do so, because I have got the most phenomenal letters coming through to me of quite the most extraordinary Bigfoot encounters that you truly don't want to be missing out on. And to my subscribers, I do send you loads and loads of love. You guys truly rock.
And let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah and all your listeners, my name is Steve, but the story I'm going to tell you needs to remain anonymous for my own personal protection. I cannot give you names, places or dates, but I will tell you my extraordinary Bigfoot encounter because I'm absolutely certain it will be of great interest to your audience of listeners. I have been working for a fire department in North America for many long years now. My father is now a retired fire chief, and as a kid growing up, I always hung around the fire station after school, during the weekends and school holidays, as I was equally as passionate about being a fireman as my father was, and maybe even more so. I would spend countless hours at the fire station, shining the fire engines up with cleaning cloths, buffing them up so that the beautiful red and silver metal literally gleamed and sparkled to a perfect shine, so much so that you could literally see your own reflection staring back at you. I would sit in the fire engine on the driver's seat with my tiny little hands on the steering wheel, making all those brumming sounds with my mouth and envisaging myself driving this marvellous piece of machinery one day. When I was a little older, I worked as a volunteer firefighter, but I never worked at my father's station because of the fear of being accused of nepotism. Finally, I did actually get a job as a full-time firefighter, and my dream came into fruition. Believe me when I say it is not a job for the faint-hearted. The men who work in this business are both passionate, dedicated, courageous individuals whom are willing to work demanding and grueling 24-hour shifts. Being a fireman is usually born from an intense desire and drive to help people in all kinds of eventualities, many times choosing to save people's lives at the very risk of losing your own. Truly, there is nothing more satisfying to me in this world than saving someone's life. It makes my life so worthwhile, rewarding and fulfilling. I have so many stories to tell of people that our fire brigade has miraculously saved, that were seemingly situations so devoid of any hope. This would have invariably amounted to horrifying consequences too dreadful to even comprehend. So many firefighters possess this incredible, remarkable, fast, quick-witted, creative and ingenious thinking that really does contribute greatly to saving so many lives. My job involves responding to fires, explosions, car accidents and medical emergencies. We spend ages cleaning our trucks and service equipment, and we often talk to community groups and schools. We teach kids as well as members of the public all about fire safety and what to do if you have an accidental fire at your home, and how to manage the situation lest it gets out of control. Most of the men I work with tend to work 24 hours on and 48 hours off schedules, typically starting and ending shifts at about 7 a.m. The first thing we do on a shift is to ensure that all our equipment, like our trucks and breathing apparatus, are in apple pie order. We then tend to engage in an hour of physical fitness daily to make sure we keep in great physical shape for the demands of our jobs, because believe me, you do not want to be out of shape when you're tackling a challenging fire, because dealing with that intense heat and the physical exertion can take exhaustion to a whole new level. We also do our bit at the fire department to help in disaster relief, like ice storms, wildfires and hurricanes. And of course, our jobs are not without major risks. And on average, I have to say that about 10 firefighters lose their lives tragically in North America every year. And these men are truly fallen heroes, in my opinion. My story begins when we were called out to an area of natural forest where many campers were being trapped by the ravages of a wild, rampant, orange-red fiery inferno that was spreading dangerously fast, literally carpeting the entire valley with blankets of thick velvet black smoke that was curling, rolling and folding down the natural timber like pieces of tissue paper. The first thing we did as a team was to douse the existing fire with water and spray down the area with fire retardants. It was a tough job and exhausting work. People were being rescued from areas totally overwhelmed with the hot inferno. Many survivors were being evacuated by helicopters, and for many witnesses, they described what they saw as being like Armageddon. Being caught up in a forest fire is a terrifying ordeal for people, and sometimes even the fear associated with the terror can be more deadly than the fire itself. As firefighters, we are equipped to deal with these harrowing, treacherous experiences with a steely courage and conviction. As I was dousing the fire, I noticed a bedraggled heap of what I can only describe as a mass of singed hair lying in the corner under a tree, barely breathing. I suddenly noticed that the strange hairy form appeared to be moving, and so I dashed over to what I assumed was a person wearing a somewhat peculiar looking fuzzy coat of some kind to give them the emergency life-saving help that they invariably needed. I realised almost immediately that this human was actually covered in real hair, and so it couldn't be human at all. But what was it? I could not imagine. In that moment I did not care, because my sole intention was to save this humanoid hairy form, regardless of what it was. The creature was about 4 feet tall, 300 pounds, and covered in hair that was singed by the fire and smelt burnt. To my horror, the poor creature was barely conscious, with seriously impaired, very shallow breathing, and there was a clear evidence of soot around the nose and mouth area. The creature's brown eyes were rolling back in their sockets, not a good sign, and it appeared both confused and disorientated. I immediately called Michelle, an EMT I often worked with in emergency situations, and whom I knew extremely well. We put the creature out of harm's way, away from all the prying eyes, behind some trees that had not been damaged by the fire, and on an open clearing that had been saturated with lots of water. Michelle was whispering to me and looking at me with a look of deep concern growing on her face. "Do not tell anyone about this," she said, looking at me intently with her kind blue eyes. "If the government finds out about this creature, they will definitely kill him. They don't want the public to know that it exists. We need to help it or it will die." I looked at Michelle with a look of confusion on my face. "Michelle," I said, "what in God's name are you talking about? You're not making any sense at all." "Look," said Michelle, "can you not see? This creature is not human. I'm almost certain it's a little Bigfoot." I was stunned. I watched Michelle examining the creature and measuring its vitals and administering oxygen to the animal. The creature was in a very bad way, and I truly thought it wasn't going to pull through. It looked like the life was literally ebbing from its body, and it seemed to be deteriorating rapidly. And when this happens, you usually get the most grim outcome you can imagine, and the creature normally dies. But Michelle continued to oxygenate the creature's blood until it started splattering and coughing violently, and a black coal-like tar emerged from its mouth. I suddenly had this very strange feeling that I was being watched. Michelle and I looked up, and we both saw this monstrous-looking creature standing behind a tree, watching us intently with a look of heightened concern on its face. I realised almost immediately that this was the Bigfoot's mother, who was clearly terrified about losing her child. She watched us closely, seemingly unfazed that we could see her so clearly. On the contrary, she wanted us to know that she was there, waiting for her child. She seemed to understand that we were doing our level best to save its life. I looked up at her only very briefly, as I was so intent on helping the little Bigfoot to recover and regain full consciousness, because there was no way we could take this strange humanoid to the hospital in an ambulance without drawing too much unwelcome attention to the creature, and that's the last thing we wanted to do. The mother Bigfoot was absolutely enormous. She must have been 8 foot tall and 700 pounds, and she was covered in coal-black hair from head to foot. It was clear that she was female, not only because of her gentle feminine energy, but her pert breast tissue on her chest told me that she was definitely female. She stood there watching us continuously with very soft brown eyes. She had a cone-shaped head that had a tiny little point on the top and blended seamlessly into a pair of enormous shoulders. The creature was in far better shape than many of the firefighters that work at our station, because every part of her body rippled with muscle, and she was shredded and ripped. Her arms were long like that of a primate, but they were exceedingly strong and muscular like that of a very strong man. In a nutshell, she looked like a humanoid ape. As the creature coughed, it spat out a lot more of that nasty-looking black-like soot, and suddenly it seemed to come out of its confused state, and its little frightened brown eyes looked up at us in surprise, with a look of confusion all over its face. Almost immediately the mother started chattering away to the creature in some kind of strange language that sounded remarkably like gibberish. However, what she was saying to the little Bigfoot enabled him to physically relax and almost immediately calm down. He seemed to surrender comfortably to the help we were administering to him without any resistance. Much to my relief, the oxygen therapy we gave the creature and the medication clearly brought it out of its confused state very fast, and before long it got up and ran into its mother's arms. The reunion between the two was so touching that I could feel the tears welling up in my eyes. The mother ran her huge humanoid hands through the little creature's hair, pulling away some of the black muck entangled within its hairy layers, and she wet her fingers with her pink tongue and wiped the black soot away from the little creature's mouth area with a very large finger. The little creature rubbed its little hairy face into its mother's downy stomach and clutched its mother's arm tightly with its hands. I looked up, and the mother Bigfoot looked directly at me and held my gaze, and in that moment it appeared that she was painting a picture in my mind. Suddenly I saw it very clearly. It was a vivid picture of a little Bigfoot sitting on a tree, waiting for its mother to return. I then felt this gratitude and thankfulness flood over me. It was like this Bigfoot mother was telling me that she had left her baby up in the tree and asked him to wait there for her, which it had done dutifully, to its own peril, which was why it got ravaged by that horrible fire. It truly felt that she was thanking us for our fast intervention in saving her child's life. All I can say is this: I have never experienced anything like this before. I believe it was telepathic communication, and to affirm it, Michelle had also received exactly the same message from the Bigfoot mother when she had looked directly into both of our eyes. The Bigfoot mother then nodded to us and turned around with her little child's legs wrapped around her hips and shoulders. We watched her glide away into the forests, and she moved with such agility and grace. She was so beautiful to watch, and I shed a happy tear as I watched them go. "Thank you," said Michelle, looking at me gratefully. "Thank you so much for your discretion. I never knew that Bigfoot was real until a few moments ago. But I knew if this got out, that we had found a Bigfoot child, I'm almost certain that the government would have sworn everyone to secrecy and maybe eliminated the creature. I couldn't let that happen to him. He deserves to live in peace and be reunited with his mother, like he happily is now. Look how happy and grateful she was." "I wholeheartedly agree," I said. "I'm glad we've kept this secret." I walked away from that experience thrilled to have saved the Bigfoot's life and to have encountered two seemingly serene, very gentle creatures that are formidable but majestic at the same time. It did make me realize that there is much more to this world than we imagine, and that we need to preserve and protect our forests so that these elusive, wonderful creatures can thrive. They deserve respect and to be treated with compassion because they're extraordinary, remarkable, and intelligent creatures. I do not want your listeners to think that fires are all bad news, because they can have invaluable benefits to the earth, like cracking seeds open to encourage germination in the fertile, ashy ground. It also destroys the thick understory in the forest, which reduces competition for seedlings, encouraging new growth and providing food for animals. Having said all that, the increase in wildfires in recent years has been attributed to global warming, and sometimes the damage on the ground can be so severe that it loses its ability to retain fluid, causing loss of vegetation and damage to lakes and rivers. I must confess that on the subject of the hairy humanoid known as Bigfoot, I truly never considered the existence of such a creature remotely plausible. But now I realise that I was very wrong. This creature is real. It gives me a greater determination to preserve our forests more than ever before here in North America, keeping the natural habitat of these forests thriving and abundant for these beautiful and majestic creatures. Thank you so very much, Steve, for such an amazing story. Tonight's story is one of 4 letters that come all the way from Russia with 4 separate accounts of Bigfoot encounters. So let's get started. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Olga, and on my father's side of the family, we're all previously from Russia, and I want to assure you that not every Russian woman is trying to snag an American man for herself, which is just one of those awful stereotypes that doesn't carry much weight and that most Russians absolutely hate. Although let's face it, who in their right mind wouldn't want a green card? America and Canada are the most stunningly beautiful countries in the entire world, but then I am exceedingly biased because I am half American. My mother, for example, is a fully fledged American Southern belle who met my father when he was working for the American Embassy out here, and they bumped into each other on the street. By random chance. It was raining cats and dogs on that day, and my mother was getting soaked in her thin cotton dress that clung to her body like a wet rag. My father described her as looking so bedraggled that she looked exactly like a drowned kitten. Naturally, being the gentleman he was, he wasted no time in offering her cover and shelter under his umbrella. He then asked her to join him for a coffee. She could not resist the lure of his Russian charm and sexy accent, and so the rest is history. They fell in love and subsequently got married. 2 years later, I was born in Washington State, where I now currently reside. Russians have a reputation for being aggressive, being atrocious drivers, drinking excessive amounts of vodka, saying exactly what they think, and being communists. But not all of those stereotypes are actually true, although the driving one and saying what you think may be. However, I so often get asked by American friends of mine, and especially about the Russian bride stuff, which they tease me relentlessly about. I'm always being told that Russian women infinitely prefer American men. But I promise you, if you walk down the streets of Russia today, you will see many happy Russian couples and women who would never consider looking elsewhere for love. It is true that young people in Russia are exceedingly ambitious and really want to aspire to great and big things. Life is much easier in Russia today than it was in my grandmother's generation. People pretty much have everything these days, especially if they work in the big cities. In my grandmother's day, people were poorer but a whole lot happier and much more satisfied with their lives. It seems as if there is a growing restlessness among the Russian youth today, as if they're searching for something that they just cannot find. The more materialistic they become, the less fulfilled and enriched they feel. This is very noticeable to my grandmother's generation, who watch their children's children with raised eyebrows, secretly wondering if all this exponential growth in materialism has any long-lasting value at all. My Bigfoot encounter happened when I visited my grandmother on my father's side at her home in the Russian countryside. Life in the Russian countryside has really changed over the years. Nowadays, all the young people gravitate towards the main towns like Moscow and St. Petersburg, and more people have left their country villages behind. You can find some villages today feeling like ghost towns, with some homes even being left abandoned. The younger generation love buying houses in the countryside, but it invariably needs to be in close proximity to the main towns and is ideally used as a weekend retreat. The further away you live, the less value your property holds. So in commercial real estate, it truly is a case of location, location every time, as is the case almost anywhere else in the world. As recently as the early 60s and 70s, those villages were teeming with people who would get up as early as 4 o'clock in the morning to fire up their ovens, as they didn't have any gas connections in those days. The local people needed to eat, so it was something everyone had to do back then. You can only imagine how stifling hot the homes would become in the middle of summer. My gran said you would literally roast like a pig on a spit. People in those days interacted much better than they do today, and everybody knew each other. Nowadays, some Russians in their villages have actually gone to the extent of putting up iron fences around their homes, and sadly, some of them don't even know their neighbours, but this usually happens among the younger generation. The village where my grandmother lives in Russia is very rural and very remote, and is fortunately bustling with activity from the locals who raise turkeys, pigs, chickens, goats, and even cows, and they all grow a lot of their own vegetables, especially tons and tons of potatoes. When I arrived in Russia for a months-long holiday to spend with my grandmother in the Russian countryside, I was 29 at the time, and it was in 2015. I had never met my grandmother in my life, nor had I ever visited Russia before, so I had no idea what to expect about this great country. When I visited her, I was amazed how humble my grandmother's lifestyle was, and how self-sufficient she was, and it rather reminded me of the people in North America who know how to live completely off-grid. My grandmother was elderly, but not in the slightest bit frail. She had meat on her bones and possessed a robust, strong figure. I noticed a limp in her left leg that dragged a little on the ground when she walked. Her weathered, sun-kissed face was dotted with liver spots that were somewhat endearing, as they clearly revealed that life had not always been easy for her. Her rural home was a little run down and faded, and had indeed seen better days. There had been attempts to revitalise the house with a coat of bright pink paint, which did have a brightening effect, and really was quite uplifting. She also possessed some really shabby, tired outbuildings where she raises alpine and Anglo-Nubian goats and chickens. Her neighbours raise turkeys and pigs, so the village community actively exchanges their fresh produce among each other, thus enabling greater self-sufficiency. There is a village shop where you can buy all the basics, but the prices there are always spiked, so it's better to do your main shopping in the cities like Moscow or St. Petersburg. However, the village shop is great, and it is useful if you need to buy some bellinis or a quick loaf of bread. The rural houses in my grandmother's village are very open without any boundary walls, and the houses blend seamlessly on a never-ending expanse of open countryside that stretches back for miles, with long grasses and pretty wild flowers growing through this open wilderness. It is an intriguing, picturesque world of goats grazing freely, several calves and even flocks of geese dotted around this vast open expanse. One morning after my grandmother had collected a dozen eggs from her chicken coop, she proceeded to make me the Russian staple breakfast of thin lacy pancakes served with thick sour cream and blueberry jam. Although different to our traditional American pancakes, these tasted delicious, and I do strongly recommend trying them. I want to go to the forest today, she told me, to pick up some wild strawberries. Are you going to come with me? Sure, I said. Why not? I did not require much prodding because I adored strawberries, but I had not heard of wild ones before. So armed with plastic buckets, we ventured into the forest. It was a glorious sunny day with a moderate even temperature, and there was a refreshing cool breeze. The forest was full of lots of tall, slender trees with white bark, and its pretty floors were literally covered with wild strawberries that dangled prettily from the green foliage. I squatted down on my 2 legs and popped a strawberry into my mouth, and it was the sweetest, juiciest strawberry I have ever tasted in my entire life, far superior to what you might buy at your grocery store. I started to gather some strawberries in my bucket, and then I got the very strange feeling that something or someone was watching me. I looked around curiously to see if I could see who it was, but there was nobody there. Shrugging my shoulders and telling myself I was imagining things, I continued to pick the fruit. I suddenly noticed that wild strawberries were being flung into my plastic bucket, almost as if an invisible being was helping me gather fruit. It was really peculiar because I could not see who this individual actually was. I then heard the person whistling, and I thought someone was playing a joke on me. But as I surveyed the area, I could see no one there. More and more strawberries were being flung into my bucket, without a single miss. It was like watching balls being aimed at a basketball net, seamlessly, without the ball ever missing the perfect sequence. My grandmother was at the other end of the forest picking strawberries, so I couldn't quiz her about my mystery helper, who was enabling my buckets to explode with huge amounts of strawberries, and was throwing them from far away. I looked up again, and I thought I could see some tree branches moving against the wind, unnaturally, so I knew that the person who was helping me gather fruit was hiding over there. I decided to go over and thank this comical man, whoever they were, for helping me. I could see a touch of red hair blazing brightly through the foliage. I knew that there was no one red-headed in our village, so I was eager to meet this new person, whoever they were. As I approached the tree, I saw a huge creature squatting on the ground, and he was covered from head to toe with red hair, much like that of a red setter or a cocker spaniel. The creature was utterly enormous, and he looked like a huge, big, cuddly teddy bear, although this thing was not a bear, but a humanoid ape-like creature. The strange creature looked up at me in total surprise and studied me curiously with bright, amused-looking brown eyes. I realized the creature was a female because she had breasts covered with fur, and she had very long arms that reminded me of a sloth or orangutan, only they were much more muscular. I noticed the head was cone-shaped, and it blended seamlessly into the shoulders, and if there was a neck, it wasn't clearly visible to me. The long face was pinkish-brown with a distinctive brow ridge and a flat, large nose and a slender mouth. Not once did I detect, not even for a single moment, any animosity from the creature, although she was holding the tree branch and twitching it nervously in her humanoid large hands, almost as if she was a little bit on the shy side. For a moment I locked eyes with this creature, and I rarely sensed her warmth and intelligent demeanour. The creature rose up from the ground, and I noticed that she was extraordinarily tall, at about 8 feet and 600 pounds. As she did this, she kept looking at me, and she started to chatter to me, as if she was talking to me, and she sounded like a monkey. I pointed to the buckets of strawberries, and the creature reached out for a handful like it was a box of popcorn, and then squatted again and started to eat the strawberries. And I sat down and joined her, and we were literally yards apart. It was like something in a dream, sitting down near a huge creature like this, eating wild strawberries on the forest floor. It was a magical moment. Even though we were so different, this special moment brought us together as if we had been lifelong friends. It just felt so natural. Suddenly I heard my grandmother's calls, and I just wanted her to shut up and go away. Why did she have to ruin this moment? Imagine for a second something exciting is happening to you when you're watching your favourite sports team that's scoring a goal, and that's the very second when someone starts nagging you or screaming out your name and robbing you of a second in time that you can never ever get back. It was exactly like that. My grandmother came into view, and I heard her saying, "Oh, there you are!" I heard a rustle and turned around and could see the creature had vanished like a ghost, and I was so utterly disappointed. This unlikely moment spent in a Russian forest was possibly the best moment in my entire life, now cut so unfairly short and sabotaged totally with the appearance of my grandmother, who normally I would have been thrilled to see. My grandmother looked at me strangely. "You look awfully cross," she said. "No, I'm not," I said defensively. My grandmother looked at my buckets of strawberries. "How did you gather so much so fast?" she said. "I need to bring you
strawberry picking more often. As we walked back home, I hardly heard a word my grandmother said, as I kept reviewing the memory of my encounter with this powerful, beautiful creature of such a graceful, gentle, warm energy. What was it, I wondered? I'd never seen such an extraordinary creature before, and as far as I knew, there was no creature like this in North America either. It was then that I remembered all the interest in Bigfoot-like creatures on American television. And then I struck pay dirt. Of course, this creature was a Bigfoot. So they were real. I was amazed. I told my grandmother what I'd seen in the forest because I was bursting to tell her about my strange and wonderful encounter with this curious, hairy, humanoid Bigfoot creature. I was almost certain she was not going to believe me, but I was surprised because she did. "You saw the red-headed giant," she said, looking at me aghast, "and you ate strawberries with her? No wonder you looked so cross when you saw me, because I spoilt your sweet little picnic. You are a very lucky girl," she said, "because the hairy giant that lives in the forest is very elusive and keeps himself or herself to himself, and sightings of him or her are few and far between." "How do you know about these creatures?" I asked in surprise. "Well, dear, I've lived here all my life, and those red-headed giants are very gentle creatures, but exceedingly elusive. People have only had sightings of the creature a handful of times, and you come waltzing over here from America and virtually have a picnic with this thing. What have you got that I haven't?" I smiled smugly to myself, knowing that this creature had squatted down with me to eat strawberries was such a privilege. I was thrilled, moved, and touched, to say the least. I wish I could take a photograph of the creature to show my friends in America, because they would never believe that I had seen a Bigfoot. In America, it's known as a Bigfoot or a Sasquatch or even a Yeti, and people dream of interactions with this creature. "You'll never get a photograph of the creature," said my grandmother. "People have tried before in Russia, and the photographs end up all fuzzy, because the creatures have a natural cloaking device, so no photograph is going to prove its existence, because it will always appear distorted." "Oh, so you mean the photograph will be so out of focus, so you can never prove you actually saw one?" "Exactly. It'll always be blurred, and people will always question a blurred picture and think you're hiding something." "We did have a Bigfoot upset the locals once," said my grandmother. "It was long before you were born. I was about 8 or 9 at the time." "What happened?" I asked. "It was not the red giant, it was another species. There are different kinds of these creatures, you know. I never saw him myself, but one of the locals did at the time, and said the creature looked like the devil himself. He's dead now, but you can speak to his daughter about it. She'll remember the story." I watched my gran putting the strawberries in a huge pot with water and sugar as she started to cook the jam. I could see the red concoction bubbling like a molten volcano on the stove as I listened to my grandmother continue with her story. "I know that was one night the village won't forget. People were shaken up," she said. "I gather this creature was huge, covered with black hair and glowing red eyes, and it was seen standing over the pigsty with a massive pig in his hands. People were terrified of this thing. I did go and see the lady in question, and she recounted a story which I will send you in my next letter. Until then, I hope your listeners enjoyed my story. Meeting that female Bigfoot changed my life forever. I am now fascinated by Bigfoots and do as much research as I can, and always go back to Russia to get more insight. I still think of this Bigfoot that I met with so much fondness and love, because she was so gentle and so intelligent, and I consider myself to be one of the luckiest people in the world to have ever met her. I gave her the name Autumn because of her beautiful, shining red hair. Isn't that the most wonderful story? Thank you, Olga, so much for sending it to me. You know how lucky you are to sit on a forest floor eating wild strawberries with a red-headed giant like Bigfoot. Until next time, goodbye and good night.